Hey everybody, how you doing? This is another top 5 video, and today I'm going to be discussing my top 5 studies to learn for AQA Psych Paper 2. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the work of Skinner, Pavlov, Bandura, or Sperry. Now, I'm not going to talk about Skinner, Pavlov, or Bandura because they're named on the specification, and although I wouldn't say, one particular study of theirs was a key study, you do have to know their research and contributions generally. So I'm not going to mention those because you have to know them. Sperry, again, is an interesting one because Sperry isn't a key study in itself, but you do have to know split brain research, and Sperry is kind of the king of split brain research, right? And you probably know his study already, so I'm not going to bother mentioning that. So, with that out of the way, what are the top 5 studies that I would recommend learning? Let's do it. Number 5 is Schneider et al.'s study of people who'd experienced brain injuries. What they found was basically the longer they'd spent in education, so the more educated they were, the greater their chance of a disability-free living. Yeah, so the greater their chance of recovery. Why do I recommend this? Well, it's a really good example, probably the only one in most of the textbooks, of some functional recovery research. Yeah. It's really useful as well for discussing individual differences and evaluating things like plasticity and recovery, because that education level is an individual difference. So you could talk about generalizability of plasticity and recovery research and theory generally. It could also be that it's helpful as an example of something that could be socially sensitive to talk about the implications of research into recovery and plasticity, because it could be that people who are less educated or have spent less time in the education system maybe get discriminated against in terms of, they're not going to be able to recover. Yeah. Anyway, that's my position 5 pick. Number 4 is Cifre, the Caveman. So you probably know this one. This is an isolation study where he spent 6 months down in a cave in Texas, although he's been elsewhere, like he's done one in the Alps. No lights, no kind of contact with what's going on in the outside world, none of that. Just him and food and water, and he had a light and he had books and stuff, but yeah, no contact with the outside world. Erratic rhythm to start with, sleep-wake cycle, but it nicely settled into a rhythm of 24.9, or just call it around 25 hours. So why is this a good study to learn? Well, it's a nice example of circadian rhythm research. So, if you get a question saying discuss research into circadian rhythms or just biological rhythms generally, that's one you can include. It's also a good study to talk about the role of EPs and EZs. So it supports the role of endogenous pacemakers because Cifre could maintain this 25-hour rhythm. Yeah, but that initial period of being erratic, and also the fact that it didn't actually settle to 24, it settled to 25, supports the fact that we need exogenous Zeitgebers to maintain and reset our rhythms as well. You can't just rely on EPs to stay in sync with the outside world. There's also lots to discuss here. If this, were an essay on research, you could talk about control because he had artificial lights down there. You could talk about generalizability. He's on his own. He's male. Whatever else it might be. Yeah. My pick number 3 is the work of Eleanor Maguire and colleagues who studied taxi drivers. So they were compared with a group of control drivers, and they found that in the taxi drivers there were significantly larger volumes of grey matter in their hippocampus. Now you probably know that the hippocampus is linked to long-term memory and spatial navigation, so that makes sense. But this is really good to use as a study supporting plasticity, because this is about the role of jobs or the role of life experience, the role of learning. Yeah, taxi drivers need those skills to do their job, and that's had an impact, according to this study, on the hippocampus. Yeah, so plasticity. It's also got some nice links to localization, hasn't it? Because what it's also reinforcing is that link between a particular brain region and a particular ability. So the fact that LTM or navigation is tied to the hippocampus. It's also worth knowing as an example of a quasi-experiment because that IV wasn't manipulated. And also they did some correlational work with it as well, looking at the correlation between the length of time that these people had been a taxi driver and the growth in the hippocampus. So although, you wouldn't necessarily need to explain it that way in the exam, it's worth having a real-world kind of example to hang your hat on, if you like, if you're talking about correlations and quasi-experiments in research methods. Okay, next it's the work of Carl Lashley and his studies on rats. So Lashley is so underrated at A-level. Anyway, Lashley basically did a lesion, so he deliberately kind of cut or damaged the brain in these rats, right? And he taught them to run mazes, and he timed them, and basically what he's looking at was, if I damage the brain, how much does that actually affect their behaviour or their learning? Okay, and what he came up with is the idea that it doesn't really matter where you damage the brain, it's more about how much damage there is, and he called this the principle of mass action. And it basically undermines localization, because it wasn't so much that, if you damaged one area, then there was a specific deficit that he saw. As I said, it was more about the extent of the damage. So what he argued was that this shows that the brain is kind of working together, and that learning was distributed around different parts of the brain, like over the whole brain in a kind of network. So as long as there was enough of that network going on still, undamaged, then the behaviour was generally fine. So it's a really good way of undermining localization, but also linking into plasticity. So he came up with the theory of equipotentiality based on this work. And it was the idea that, even if there is damage to some of these bits, nearby regions or similar regions might be able to adapt or pick up the slack from that function. So this suggests that the brain can adapt after damage, which again, as I said, supports plasticity. So it's quite a nice one to know. And there's lots of discussion there because it's an animal study, so you could have a discussion about generalizability and stuff as well. Okay, pick number 1 is tan. It had to be, really, didn't it? So this was the patient that Broca studied in life. He was called Tan, as I'm sure you know, because that was the only thing he could say. He completely understood what was going on. You'd have a conversation with him, to him, I suppose. You could ask him questions and he could respond. He understood what was going on. He could follow instructions. But the only noise he could make was tan. So this is really important because at post-mortem, after he died, what they found was significant damage in the left posterior frontal lobe. Now, I know that sounds quite fancy, but basically that's where Broca's area is, The left side of the brain towards the back of the frontal lobe. Now, this is really good support for localization. It shows that that particular brain region is tied to language function, speech. So it supports localization. But you could have a discussion about the fact that this was only found after his death, so maybe it's only correlational support. You could have a discussion about the fact that it's only a case study and it's only an individual, and maybe this limitation undermines the support provided for localization. So there's a really nice big chunky paragraph there. It's also worth knowing as an example of post-mortem for studying the brain. So you could work into an essay on studying the brain an example of research. You could talk about the applications of the post-mortem as a way of studying the brain, and you could use Broca's study of tan to illustrate that. It's also worth knowing, in case you get a question on the role of case studies in psychology, in the research methods section, or even just strengths and limitations of case studies. So bringing this in as an example to illustrate your arguments, if you're evaluating case studies, could be helpful. I've only gone and done an honourable mention, haven't I? Now, what have I picked? I've picked Damiola's study of circadian rhythms in mice. Don't worry if you've never heard of this one. It does depend on which textbook you use. I've started putting this one in a bit more recently. I've come to quite like this one. So, mice are nocturnal. So what Damiola and her colleagues did was they shifted their feeding times by 12 hours to see if they could kind of make them not, nocturnal, I suppose. And what they found was that this shift in feeding patterns shifted the circadian rhythms of these mice, but only in liver cells and not actually in the SCN. It didn't affect the function of the SCN. So what does this show? It shows the importance of exogenous zeitgebers, such as feeding. And when you learn about exogenous zeitgebers, light is obviously the key one, but you do talk about social cues and meal times as another example. So this supports the role of EZs, but also it undermines the role of the SCN. So if you're doing an essay just on endogenous pacemakers, you can use research like this to undermine the role of the SCN, because what it shows is that the SCN, although it's the master clock, there are other important clocks around the body. You call them peripheral oscillators. And there are cells that have this function in the liver and the heart and other regions around the body. So it undermines the power of the SCN. It shows that it's a bit more complicated than just we have this one master clock that's in charge of everyone, because these cells in the liver in this study were functioning independently of the SCN. It's also another example you could throw into a research into rhythms question. So that's why I like it anyway. Alright, that was me discussing my picks for top 5 studies, plus an honourable mention, to learn for paper 2. Good luck with it all, keep going, I hope that was useful. Let me know down in the comments how you're getting on. Cheers guys, see you again. Bish bash bosh.